So today I wanted to talk around or with the brief essay on fetishism. I apologize that one last sentence apparently is missing from the scan, but I think you can reconstruct the meaning. I can't stop returning to your double intervention about a theory that I have not read, but new theories that try to think, if I understand at least the representation correctly, that try to get beyond trauma as the place to return to in order to reverse the course of blockage or incapacitation. I guess my resistance to it, as I understood it, was that one would be simply delivered from the relationship to the trauma itself, according to that theory. And somehow it is the case in a great many theories and fantasies that trauma can become the occasion for a kind of reversal that isn't the same thing as working through it. So that part I just wanted to go back to for an instant. Those of you who remember Benjamin's on some motifs in Baudelaire will recall how he turns to Freud, one of the Freudians too, to talk about the way in which we are immunized with and against shocks in the culture industry. And there, Benjamin reminds us that in the face of traumatic or certainly at least shocking stimuli, it's not memory, but forgetting that is the problem. I'm not going to go through the essay, which isn't in front of us right now, but he talks, I'm just going to give two examples. He talks about how we try to put a date to the memory of a certain overstimulating experience in order to make it a disposable souvenir. And finally, he also talks about a certain gadget connection, by which he means the actual push buttons or levers or switches or what have you. Interestingly, he goes all the way back to the introduction of the match as the onset of that connection. This movement at the control panel, as it were, of technologization introduces a kind of comfort zone, more than just a survival zone, the comfort zone of gadget love, where it is possible to relate, in analogy at least, to the dissociation Freud talks about in fetishism. Part of that dissociation would be the implicit treatment of the mediatic apparatus as a black box, which you might recall is the point of, or one of the points of Flusser's interpretation of photography. So, on the one hand, to be a gadget-loving expert at some level does not, or perhaps cannot, at least not always, extend to a thoroughgoing understanding of the hardware itself, as it were, or technology as produced, and invites only a staggered relationship to the bottom line of technologization. There's the famous remark he makes that with the is it a switch or the depression of the button on the camera, in other words, with the shooting of the image, the moment is imbued with a posthumous shock. This is very enigmatic and has invited all sorts of interpretation, but I just want to underscore for our purposes now that it suggests the extent to which the gadget connection or gadget love provides a kind of protective loop. And finally, just to represent at least the inoculation argument more completely, Benjamin then argues that, of course, there can be an excess of immunization. This is a problem that Krauss and Halt too at one point. Derrida, of course, also speaks of in terms of a kind of autoimmune crisis. And so he talks about, as he's writing about Baudelaire, how the poet, in particular, has to be a master at dosing the inoculation, as it were, because he has to have access to the shock. It would be impossible for him to receive every shock only and always as the very shot of inoculation itself. So to introduce an inoculation model, which to my mind in the German, or to my recollection in the German setting begins with Schiller, also requires some differentiated sense of the responsibility of dosage. Okay, I just wanted to say that about, I began by talking about forgetting and memory, forgetting and remembering. Remember, in that setting, Benjamin reminds us of the distinction between a remembering that is closer to remembrance or memorialization, and then there's the remembering that is always in the service of remembering to forget. And Benjamin cites Freud at that point and suggests that it's analogous to what happens when anything is brought, or often when something is brought to consciousness. It's brought to consciousness so that it can, in a sense, also be marked as disposable, as it were, or containable, if you prefer. Okay, having said that, I want to look at the essay itself. It carries many different legacies of Freud's thought. In its sexological aspect, it has often been a kind of upsetting reading, and yet it was rewired by various film feminists, for example, as the enabling condition for that very famous reading of the male gaze and what is performed precisely for it in Hollywood films and so on. I want to suggest two things. One is I want to remind you that I was trying to read castration in terms of doubling, as the other doubling, namely division and separation. It's always still a way in doubling. Freud, in fetishism, brings us back to the anatomical frontier from the boy's point of view. But, and I'll get to the but in a moment, he also introduces yet other terms, another kind of doubling that I think lifts off from and separates itself from the plus and minus scenario of repression and horror. But in terms of the larger picture of psychoanalytic theory, let me point out to you that there is Melanie Klein, who supplemented this scene from the girl's point of view, as it were, but also underscoring the asymmetry of every intervention in psychoanalytic theory, made it universal in turn, just of course as Freud did, the boy's point of view. She argued that all of this, that the agon in its entirety begins with the breast, and these various initiations of separation and binding of separation must be modeled on, if one must be anatomical, on the breastfeeding and weaning. Also, perhaps a dated event. But in any event, that's what she offers, and even takes the very specific and for many people toxic mean and small notion of penis envy. She blows it up into her notion of envy at large, which, if it has a referent, refers to everyone's envy and murderous curiosity about the mother's creativity or her interiority, what is inside the mother. Every baby, according to kind, is going to want to scope out what is in there and scoop it out. This is where the problem of ambivalence begins, that the mother is immediately at risk, as it were, fantastically, in the close quarters of their early relationship. So, in the essay, a shift occurs, I would argue, at the point when Freud advises us that there is no necessary or decisive connection between a fetish and a phallic symbol. On 155, the imagination. This, the phallic connection, may happen often enough, but is certainly not a deciding factor. It seems rather that when the fetish is instituted, some process occurs which reminds one of the stopping of memory in traumatic amnesia. Of course, this is an analogy, but it's a surprising and powerful one. So the fetishistic relationship to memory and forgetting, as it were, is analogous to traumatic amnesia. The subject's interest comes to a halt halfway, as it were. It is as though the last impression before the uncanny and traumatic one is retained as a fetish. Now, before we go into fill in those blanks, as it were, sexologically, we already have a structure, though, by analogy with traumatic amnesia. So fetishism becomes the capacity to halt halfway up to the border of flashing back to the trauma, and yet it is a border that is also legibly the border of that trauma. But one stops short or halfway before re-entering the trauma, as it were. And cathects, occupies, invests, libidinizes the border zone itself. At the border to some traumatic event that has been determining, one is able to stop short and occupy the borderline libidinally as well. Yeah, on the preceding page, 154, I refer to the argument that this penis, the phantasmatic one that he sees as being summoned by the boy's eye view, converted to fetishism, this penis is no longer the same as it was before. Something else has taken its place, has been appointed its substitute, as it were, and now inherits the interest which was formerly directed to its predecessor. It has to, because there has been the intervention of trauma, however you want to place it. But this interest suffers an extraordinary increase as well. I just want to stop there and underscore, as important here, Freud is also attributing to the fetishistic relation this capacity to explore an almost unlimited increase in libidinal pleasure at that border. Because at the border, the trauma is neither remembered nor overcome, but it is at the same time memorialized in the mode of a curious kind of triumph. The horror of castration set up a memorial to itself in the creation of this substitute. It remains a token of triumph over the threat of castration and a protection against it. And then the segue, it's so interesting, it also saves the fetishist from becoming homosexual. To that we must add immediately, it saves the fetishist from becoming a heterosexual as well. What it defends against is sexual identity. Sexual identity in the mode of coupling. So that one could also argue that fetishism defers indefinitely, pleasurably, the step from adolescence to maturity. This step is theorized by Freud in group psychology and the analysis of the ego, for example, where he makes quite clear, even though one is forced at times to turn to such language, that he's not interested in individual psychology. Once he starts addressing the group and the group bond, it's not the individual, though he will sometimes use that word, but it's clearly the couple itself. So in the Freudian view of the socius, which begins to rev up at this time after World War I, the dialectic, if that's the right word, but anyway, the tension is between the group and the couple. The group, which is always also the adolescent group. What he's suggesting then is that in adolescence, which of course is a growing enterprise, increasingly over the years taking more and more childhood into itself and extending itself all the way up to what used to be the turning point of midlife crisis, such that we can really think of midlife crisis now as a kind of midlife criticism of adolescence that belongs to adolescence in some curious way. But in any event, it's distinctive for adolescence of the group bond itself, because the adolescent is caught between two couples, between the parental couple, which is off limits, and Freud speaks about the first rehearsal of group psychology already in earliest childhood, because of the separation from the master bedroom, as it were. Each young child is already rehearsing to be a kind of group of one, as it were. So the adolescent who has to, I suppose, anyway, that's how Freud talks about it, has to receive his or her sexuality somehow, cannot receive it from the couple, the parental couple, but must improvise it, as it were, or receive it within the group. It it's a group license originally. And well, it's easy enough in adolescence to turn one's back and continue to keep one's back turned to the parental couple, which is now not only off limits but also out of it. One wouldn't want to receive one's sexuality from the parents, and as a teenager probably. Still, there is the prospect of coupling, the group's relationship to the couple is extremely ambivalent. Ambivalent in a way that is, what shall I say, alterable perhaps by technological developments. I mean, this is one of the reasons why the group and technologization are so closely related, and why in Frankfurt School thought, for example, we always speak at once of technologization and group psychologization. Because the group is not yet able to reproduce itself or replicate itself. It has no plan for the future in that way. It harbors and fosters certainly fantasies of replication, even experiences of replication. I talked about likability last time. And I like to remember a very early slogan that Kinko's, the copy shop franchise, put out very early on, and which they quickly lost, which was making copies, making friends. The problem is, it's a double problem, well, whatever. Anyway, the point is that the group, unable to reproduce itself, has to unwillingly, ambivalently allow the couple to proceed down its aisle and start the whole process over again. So, having said all that, I go back to fetishism and point out that this moment of the virtually inevitable step down that aisle is what is deferred by being at the border through the fetishistic relation. Okay, as we already heard in what I reread for you about substitute here, what interests me, given the novelty of the fetishistic relation, is the language that is recycled but put in quotation marks via, as it were, for example, in the English translation. Because he's using the words that we're familiar with from the normal to neurotic scenario. A substitute, but also inheritance. So let me just read this again. Something else has taken its place. That something, of course, is what has been lost. This is the place of missingness. Has been, so something in the place of that missingness has been appointed its substitute, as it were, and now inherits the interest which was formerly directed to its predecessor. But this interest, and so on. So, I think what one can say is that through fetishism, the substitution is itself substituted for. It's the substitution of substitution, as it were. Substitution is no longer necessary as an initiatory process. It is substitution itself that is overcome or deferred in the course of being able to enter the fetishistic relationship. Okay, and then we get to a truly surprising example in Freud's essay, which I hope confirms some of the things I've been saying already. I'm trying to pull our understanding of this essay out of the tight corner of the anatomical identifications. And that is in the midst of a reading which is, at least in an alternating way, about the so-called sexual perversion, he is suddenly drawn to talk about two sons who are not fetishists. And we've left the sexological register now two sons who both lost their fathers and yet seemed to have disavowed that loss. Okay, so he was struck by their still being functional. He says, and this is Freud in his courageous mode, he says, this runs counter to everything that I thought up to this point about the difference between neurosis and psychosis. In the case of neurosis, a piece of the id is disavowed. In the case of psychosis, a piece of reality is disavowed. Here, the reality of loss would appear to be disavowed, and yet these two sons are not psychotic. Let's go to that section. But further research led to another solution of the contradiction. It turned out that the two young men had no more scotomized or foreclosed, if you prefer, disavowed their father's death than a fetishist does the castration of women, than a fetishist does the prospect of annihilation. It was only one current in their mental life that had not recognized their father's death. There was another current which took full account of that fact. The attitude which fitted in with the wish and the attitude which fitted in with reality existed side by side. Okay, this I think I find an amazing shift. We've already been introduced to dissociation. It's a relatively current term already in psychiatry. But now Halt gives us an example of what he means, at least in this case, by dissociation. The ability to see and at the same time not see a certain determining event or relationship. However we understand that, and already as I was leading into this, I suggested that much of what Benjamin suggests about the gadget lover before the control panel could also be understood in terms of this kind of dissociation. But here he introduces, without going too much further at this point, presents dissociation within the metapsychology as the disruption of the former distinction or opposition between neurosis and psychosis. Instead, we have now the prospect of the fetishist as someone, or the fetishistic relation as that which oscillates between neurosis and psychosis without, we could even call it the no man's land, between neurosis and psychosis without being downed. To my mind, given everything I've said before genealogically, it is the most succinct formulation of how, for Freud, the impasse of doubling has been brought closer to function and livability at the border with psychosis, at psychosis's border. Okay, now what's important for what I want to say next is that we also consider a certain temporality involved here. It's possible or necessary to say or to take into account that the fetishist is a loser. I mean, something has been lost and it's not disavowed. The fetishist is a loser who just the same, through this substitution of substitution itself, is able to triumph. I'm recycling some of Freud's terms in saying this. But he certainly never decides to enter this triumphal development. It's not a matter of decision, but rather for the fetishist. This is the fetishist's specific course, though via Benjamin and other people one might consider it as a course that is somehow unconsciously chosen just the same. But for the fetishist, it turns out that an initial failure, the initial loss, as it were, harbored the triumph as its byproduct. I think this is crucial for an understanding of fetishism. The fetishist begins with loss and finds an alternative circumvention of it, and discovers in relation to the initial loss that as a kind of byproduct, all along, that triumph was waiting for him or her. The loss can be written off, thus, in order to secure or even increase, to use Freud's image again, the benefits and profits of fetishism itself. So in thinking about this theory, we also cannot foreclose the loss. It's part of the whole structure. It begins in loss, but is able again to find, after the fact, that loss harbored as its byproduct a triumphal fetishistic alternative. So this is what I wanted to establish, so as to think a bit about the German and also historically the Nazi German launching of the rocket. In one of the many popular science books that were published in Germany during the 30s and 20s and 30s, and 40s probably too, on plane flight in particular. Plane flight was especially cathected in Germany at the time. A certain Carlsson, this is one example in lieu of many, observes at one point that the utopian aspect of flight, as he puts it, it's not so much that we can thus traverse, crisscross vast distances, but it is that we can, as he puts it, at any moment take off. Which, I give you that example because, of course, whenever we want to take off at any time, it underscores the phantasmatic component, which is precisely that instant of taking off, of, as I would put it, transforming the wound of loss, transforming the gravity, the pull of loss, the grave of loss, transforming that entire wound into the wonder or miracle of takeoff and flight. To get out of that impasse is the impulse that is carried forward throughout the investment in plane flight, so that it, however, culminates in the launching of the V2 rocket. Sure. Anytime.
So it's very helpful to have the temporal interwoven here. But I wonder why it's triumph that is at the end. Why is it not tragedy? Why is it not something that is, why does it have an inherent positivity to it?
Well, I'm quoting Freud. He speaks of triumph, which is amazing. I agree it's amazing, but it's in quotes. Yeah, I mean, triumph, the deferral of tragedy. We could look for other terms. I'm more invested right now in the affect, as it were, that he shares via fetishism with certain developments that I'm talking about. I mean, that very word is used as already part of fetishism. You know, it's powerful, but it's wrong, of course. It's not, unless you've signed up with the fetishistic fantasy, it's of course off. I'm wanting to, right now, just to capture that offense. But yeah, he speaks of triumph for the fetishist. And certainly, as I'm going to indicate now, quasi-historically, the triumph of the V2 is the byproduct of the utter failure, I guess, for the Germans of the tragic failure of their Luftwaffe, of their Air Force. It's those two developments that I want to read together under the aegis of what I like to think of as crypto-fetishism.
And if I could, in the fetishist procedure, it cannot be libidinally assimilated, but then I'm wondering if displacement is also at work with the side of the trauma and the capacity for the substitution of substitution, and to what extent is displacement occurring in relationship to the distant object of the original site of trauma.
Well, if displacement had been possible, then fetishism wouldn't have been necessary. If substitution had been possible, the substitution of substitution itself wouldn't have been possible. Topographically, one can always use displacement, but as a concept, in Freud anyway, displacement would belong to a normal to neurotic scenario of working through.
Right.
Because displacement is only a brief deferral of what has to be worked through. That's why I think it runs counter to Freud's construction here of a special case that can't be subsumed by the normal to neurotic. But if you're interested, Winnicott sees this differently. He sees fetishism instead as something that emerges out of the consolidation of antisocial tendencies, for example, via secondary gain. So once it's a question of having to handle a turbulent material so as to have a relationship to it, which is roughly how he puts it. Something like a fetishistic relation emerges in place of the hope that he talks about with regard to the original antisocial behavior. So that might remove fetishism from the exceptional status that I think Freud gives it, and Benjamin too, and there are different reaches. If you're interested in it.
Yeah.
Okay, so to get to flight now, I want to start over again briefly with evolution, as it were. By which I mean Freud always saw the theory of evolution as most closely allied to psychoanalysis itself, especially in its capacity of serving as a kind of endopsychic genealogy. But to understand Freud's investment, we need something like science fiction, because I don't want to get into a close reading of Darwin now, and it's not perhaps what I need right now. This is, even for Freud, perhaps phantasmatic, but it falls into two parts. There's, of course, the slow-mo notion of change developing through adaptation. It's something that's almost invisible, one is almost unable to catch the slow motion development in the act of change, as it were. Certainly between the recognizable species, which is why one had to postulate something like missing links, that which was caught up and disposed of after the fact in the course of an evolutionary development. So the slow-mo version of the theory requires, to bring us back to our themes, reproduction and death as the lab space in which the adaptations develop over time. But I find that, at least in this reception of the theory, that already the notion of a missing link brings back a kind of link with the missing, that the affirmation of this milieu of reproduction and death would align. But then there is the fast track of evolution, something that Samuel Butler almost immediately made the basis of his, later on he didn't even think of it as a satire. It's really a very close reading of this other version of evolution, which he pulls out from between the lines. And he pulls it out from between the lines in order to include technology. Remember, in Erewhon, he argues that the machines, as he's still putting it in the mid-19th century, the machines are now on the fast track of evolution. They are doing the developing for us, and human beings are just the genitals of the machines, still supplying, for the time being, that milieu of reproduction and death, while the machines go off on a new fast track that one can observe of change. And skipping Erewhon now, so many science fiction narratives, including films, of course, are precisely about that, the conceit that suddenly plant life, for somehow, is switched to the fast track and now devours us, or whatever. What I would like to argue is that through this, evolution somehow became the occasion for the first ability to conceive of a kind of genealogy of technologization and its influence upon us that went beyond a mere history of machines, for example. And this is something that I think Freud picked up on. The one piece of evidence I want to give right now is a remark he makes in passing in his 1932 new introductory lecture on Weltanschauung, which is usually left untranslated in the English, worldviews or ideologies or whatever. It's an interesting text because it's his occasion to distinguish his science from Marxism at that time when there was a lot of experimental mergers between psychoanalysis and Marxism. And so he pulls out this funny kind of evolutionary fast-track reading that I've been talking about as his counterexample. The one I'm thinking of is when he says that It's through the taking off of artificial flight that World War I was already on the map. It was when the Zeppelin crossed the Channel and English airspace that the war was already on. So that change and all the mutational changes that followed from the war itself that we considered via shell shock, for Freud, reflect the way in which a sudden technological extension of the senses, of one's range of movement, of one's range of communication, of all of the above, how that can suddenly alter everything catastrophically. Another example of the fast track that I'm kind of fond of is the recent scientific attempts, which I however only read about in newspapers, to postulate, as of maybe 4 or 5 years ago, the origin of the dog. Whereas before, one spoke of a long period of domestication that then became part of the program. Now, or as of 5 years ago, whenever it was, in Sweden and California and various sites, researchers came to agree through DNA analysis that what must have happened only, was it 50,000 or really not too long ago in evolutionary terms, that all of a sudden a couple of wolves, in the theory are referred to as the Eves, a couple of wolves underwent a change in their DNA which made them programmed to read the nonverbal communication of humans, so that they suddenly approached the sites of human habitation, following, reading them, in a sense also teaching the humans something about interspecial alliance. And I'm sure, of course, that they were mistaken as voluntary quarry in the beginning, that we probably ate the first dogs, which moves me to think of this as the alternative to the primal father legend, that the first dogs were in fact the primal father, from which the rest follows according to Taboo. That's my fantasy. But just the same, I give it to you as another example taken out of science via popular science, where one is working increasingly with more sudden, not necessarily catastrophic, but more sudden changes